Welcome to the second part of this very little series about the Entity Framework Core in Blazor Server. In the last video, we have created the whole application, and in the end, I have told you about possible problems. And possible is the wrong word. You pretty sure will run into these problems if you use it the way I have shown you in the first video. But no worries, with some little tricks, we can prevent these problems from happening. Now, there are different ways in which you can encounter these problems. One of them is if you start the application up and then very quickly go into the page visits component. I will exactly do that now. And why we are running into problems when we do it in such a way, I will show you. So it starts up. Okay, now we should get an error message, and we get the error message here at the bottom of the screen. So now I go to the developer tools and read it out. Invalid operation exception, meaning the DbContext. A second operation started on this context before a previous operation completed. What does this mean? The DbContext is not thread safe. So if two threads at the same time, or if two operations at the same time start on one DbContext, this exception gets raised. Now, why do two threads or two operations start on the same context? Because the first time we create a new DbContext per application is always going to take a bit of a time because it has to do the connections to the database and such. And because we have written this code asynchronous, so here we will come in. Here, the dependency injection will create the first page visit context. Now, because because this is done asynchronously, we are allowed to navigate to a different page. Now we navigate then here to the page visits component, and here we want to iterate over all the page visits, so we have to load this. So at this point we have two operations. We have this one here which tries to load it, and we have the first one which still tries to create the context, or maybe it has already done that and it is and it tries to save it. Now, how can we prevent this problem? I'm just closing some pages here. So I'm creating a new class. I'm calling this class context factory. As you can see by the name, this class is going to create the context for us. I'm just making a little generic constraint, so it has to inherit from DbContext. So I could also make an interface and then like register the interface as the type and then the class as the implementation in the configure services method. But I just create a class, private, let's call it read only. Now here, iService provider. What's the service provider? When we register the services, we are using the service collection. And once the application is running, the service collection turns into the service provider. So iService provider, going to initialize it here. Now I'm going to create an instance, or let's just say create DbContext. Now, for this, I'm using the activator utilities, create instance of T, and I'm passing it the provider. So as the name suggests, activator utility is trying to create an instance of this type, and because this type has a constructor, it will search the values for the constructor in the iService provider here. Why is it not? Oh, okay, I have to use the underscore here. So Now I have to register the service. Going to startup. Okay, I've closed it. Now I am registering it as a transient. So every time we want a new context factory, we are getting a new one. Now I have to give it the context. I have called it visit context or page visit context. Yeah. Page visit context. So now I can go to the index component. Here I have to modify the whole thing a bit. Instead of the page visit context, I am injecting the context factory. I call it context factory. Now here I am creating a new page visit context. Call it page visit context. And the context factory is going to create this for us. Now I have to do this for all the why is it? Of course I have to give it the argument to page visit context. No, we don't. Okay, so we have to do this for the other components too. Just copying the code. The counter one has to be updated here. Name this counter here. Now for fetch data, the same. Again, we have to change the name of the inserted entity here to fetch data. So now the most important piece of the application here, the page visits components in which we display everything. I'm injecting here the same thing. Now, deleting here, it's as you expect. And with as you expect, I mean we just have to create the DbContext and then we can proceed as normal. But the update method is a bit different, so I'm going to delete everything here. I'm leaving the async here, and now I'm writing the update method. Now, why is the update method different? When we first created the application, so in the first video, we had the same DbContext to get all the entities, and because it's the same DbContext, it holds every entity in the change tracker, so we can just change the values of one entity and then call save changes, and it will detect those changes. But because now we have different DbContexts from which we retrieve the entity, it doesn't work that way. So we have to call page visit context entry, give it visit, state equals entity state modified, and now we can call save changes async as normal. So now we call here update, give it the item, the page visit. I've called it page visit, not item. So let's have a go. Okay, so we can now immediately go to the web to the component without anything. We can delete it, update, look if it's persisted. Okay, it's persisted now. So maybe the error message in the example to start this video is a bit abstract, but if you play around with it, you will see if you don't use the database context factory, you will run into these problems. Another way in which you could run into this problem, if here you would iterate directly over the DbContext and then the dbset, and in here you would have the same dbset and then update it, you pretty sure would run into the same problem. But now with the context factory, we've fixed this issue, and that's the way to go, to use Entity Framework Core in Blazor Server. In the most cases, you would have a repository pattern that acts as a wrapper around the DbContext, but it doesn't make that much of a difference. You would, of course, have to use Context Factory then if you want to make the operations on the repository too. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.